So the number 3 is highly significant in many cultures, probably most cultures. And Celtic cultures are no different. In general, there's many reasons for this. Ideas about like upper, lower, and earthly realms of existence, and man, woman, and child, land, water, and sky, the different stages of life, conventions of storytelling. It's just everywhere. I think 3 is also a thing which breaks up duality. So we have dark and light, for example, but there's also twilight. There's land, there's water, but what's a bog? It's interesting that it's often the interim places between the opposites which have become magical and liminal. So that also creates 3s. So I rarely venture outside Celtic culture, but I want to mention a Slavic triple god called Triglav, who's seen as a supreme deity within his world. And Triglav is represented as having 3 faces, occasionally kind of 3 heads. You can see these are older artifacts. This is a modern depiction. The artifacts are kind of varied in how the heads are attached or how the faces are attached. But his cult was centered around kind of modern day Poland. Now, the Slavs, as you may know, generally converted to Christianity quite late. And there are stories of Bishop Otto of Bamberg going around destroying statues of Triglav in the 12th century, all a bit reminiscent of St. Patrick smashing the idol of Cruach. In fact, Otto's biographers are a major source of information about Triglav. But it's difficult to say like how trustworthy their reports are, of course. However, what they describe is cult figures or idols, which were, quite large and often encased in gold or silver. And Triglav was associated with the 3 worlds, the upper earth and the lower world. Although exactly what his relationship to them was seems to be open to interpretation. I don't want to say too much, partly because I'm not sure of the quality of some of my own sources. But one idea seems to be that he had the power to break through from one realm to another, while another idea about him sees him as the power which prevents the 3 worlds from getting mixed together, because that would create chaos and an end to the world as we know it. So Triglav was also associated with the use of an unridden black stallion. I know that the art here shows him riding the stallion, and I don't know his stories, so maybe there's a time when he does, but I'm talking about a stallion that would actually be kept, which was dedicated to him and which was used as a means of divination, something which turns up in quite a few different cultures, usually to divine something based on, where the stallion goes or how it behaves. And that's an idea which is sometimes associated with sovereignty and kingship. So I mentioned Cruach a moment ago. And as I said, there was a cult of Cruach, later known as Dubh in Ireland. And Patrick was said to have destroyed at least one of his idols. And this may well be true. There are stone and a few wooden idols that have been discovered in Ireland over the years, lots of stone ones. Because the story of Cruach and Dubh is so well known, and Patrick destroying the idol, and because the custom of observing Dubh Sunday persisted into the modern era, there's been a tendency to believe that, kind of every idol that's found must be Cruach. But there's absolutely no evidence for that, of course. It would be surprising if the Iron Age Irish were only making representations of one deity. It's kind of monotheistic thinking, isn't it? The enemy, it's Cruach, he's the bad god, instead of the Christian god. Now, the reason I've taken us down this road is because heads with 3 faces are pretty common among idols found in Scotland and Ireland. So Anne Ross wrote a paper about this one from Netherton in Lanarkshire. And one thing she brings up, which is interesting to think about, is whether this is intended to depict a deity with three faces at all, or whether the faces are three different deities. So this head up here in the right-hand corner is actually kind of on the top of the carving. So there's no, you can kind of see this photo's taken from above, and these are the two heads you can see in the picture on the left, sort of from the rear. Everything's at a really odd angle. And I think that's a reasonable question to ask. Is this a triple deity at all? There's maybe a better case for the Cruach head from Ireland as a deity with three faces or aspects, simply because it's so clearly a single head. But I think we need to be really careful not to make too many assumptions that every three-headed or three-faced effigy has the same ideas behind it. Just as we shouldn't assume that all Irish idols are Crom Cruach, we shouldn't assume that all three-faced idols are related to one another or represent the same idea. We can try to investigate them and see if there's a relationship, but that's probably something for a more detailed talk than this one. So one reason I mention this is because writers often connect Triglav to Lugus, or Crom Cruach for that matter. And I'm not ruling that out, but it's mostly conjecture from what I can see. This image shows Lugus. There are a couple of these from Llŷr, which is near Paris. And I wonder exactly what these carvings are saying about how Lugus was perceived, at least in this area. So there's no real evidence in any mythology that Lugus is in any way a triple deity that I can see. Maybe somebody has a case for it. I don't know. So did Lugus hold sway over three worlds like Triglav? Did he have three areas of skill, like Cormac's description of Brigid as three sisters who are goddesses of smithcraft and poetry and healing? I think there might be a clue in the idea of skills. I could be barking up the wrong tree, of course. This is just a theory of mine. In a number of languages, including Gaelic, the grammatical rules governing the plural don't kick in until you get to three, unlike in English, where we have, one box, two boxes. In Gaelic, it's one box, two box, three boxes. And quite a lot of languages do that. Some languages even go so far as to have different grammatical rules for one, two, and three before we get to the official plurals, maybe at four. So it's really interesting how different cultures perceive numbering and counting. And I don't want to read too much into this, but is it possible, at least within Celtic culture, maybe that the concept of many or several, or the need to begin to count things in a way, starts at three, because one and two are so blatantly obvious, it's not really a question of counting. When we, as we increase the number of things, there's an increasing need to enumerate them. So maybe the three faces of Lugus here are actually symbolic of his many skills rather than three specific things. This carving in particular on the right here, you feel like it would just repeat and repeat and repeat if the stone was bigger. You know what I mean? The faces are all kind of merged. The noses and eyes don't quite add up. So that's just a possibility that I've been thinking about as I worked on this talk, that perhaps not all the treble carvings should necessarily be read as treble individuals or triple gods or gods with three aspects, that maybe it's more symbolic of many, something which is, has a multiplicity. And how do you represent that simply in a stone carving? So if we go on to Brigid, there are actually very few references to Brigid at all in early Irish texts. There's 5 or 6. Several of these call her a poet and say that she's the daughter of Dagda. Several associate her with magical livestock and with making or inventing a sound, which in some texts is keening for the dead, and in others it's some kind of whistling, a way to signal at night or something like that. So it's only in Cormac's glossary, which is probably the earliest of these texts, that we find Brigid represented or referenced as a kind of triple goddess. So it's Brigid, a poetess, daughter of the Dagda. This is Brigid, the female sage or woman of wisdom, almost like a druidess, isn't it? Brigid, the goddess who poets adored because very great and very famous was her protecting care. Now she's starting to sound like Ceridwen. And it's therefore they call her goddess of poets by this name, whose sisters were Brigid, the female physician, and Brigid, the female smith. No other early source associates Brigid, daughter of the Dagda, with healing or with smithcraft. So it's a lovely picture, and Cormac was probably representing or reporting what he believed to be true, but it leaves some questions, I think, and I feel honestly unconvinced about Brigid's triplism and her association with smithing, simply because it's not mentioned anywhere else. The goddess in the early texts seems to be mostly associated with poetry and livestock and this wailing sound. So Saint Brigid, of course, has a strong association with healing wells and other kinds of charms and cures, which may well have come through from the earlier goddess. Brigid appears to have cognates in Brigantia and Brigindu, among other Celtic speakers, although that's up for discussion. And it's likely that this is the goddess referenced by Caesar when he writes about the Celts worshipping Minerva. He's listing here the gods the Celts worship, and of course, he's not giving them Celtic names. He's substituting what he sees as the same deity in the Roman pantheon. So he says, of the gods, they worship Mercury most of all. Well, I don't think so, but of him, there are many images. And we can kind of assume from this next bit that he's talking about Lugus, that they extol him as the inventor of all arts, the ruler of journeys and traveling. Now that's more Mercury for sure. And they judge him to have the greatest power over obtaining money and trade. And again, that's less Llŷr or Llŷ like and more Mercury like. So there's obviously a kind of mix here. And then after him, Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva. Now concerning these, they have nearly the same opinions as the rest of people. Apollo to drive away diseases, Minerva to teach the elements of skill. Now, Mercury is quite recognizable as Llŷr, like I said, and Minerva is also associated here with skills, or some translators translate this passage as crafts. She's associated with crafts. So anyway, you look at Brigid. She does seem to be associated with skills, and I wonder again whether the tripling idea might be more a way to emphasize a multiplicity of skills, and 3 is just a way of expressing that. So I want to look at one more example from Ireland, and this is kind of folded in stories and symmetry. So not long after they'd landed in Ireland and Avergine had his poems of power, the sons of Mill were still fighting kind of monsters that the Tuatha Dé Danann had raised against them. So they came to Slieve Mish, and there they met a beautiful woman. If you have hope of having a good fortune in Ireland, she said to them, you will not take it without a gift to me. What gift? They said. That my name be always and forever on this island. Well, what is your name? They asked her. Banba is my name, she said. And they went on their way. But when they came to another place called Evlinge, they met another beautiful woman, and she identified herself as Fódhla and said that her name must be upon Ireland. And Avergine said, let Fódhla be a name upon this island. And then they came to Ishnach at the center of Ireland, and there they met this beautiful queenly woman, and she welcomed the warriors, and she said that their coming had long been foretold, and she prophesied that they should have no prophet, no progeny in Ireland unless her name was on Ireland forever. And she told them that her name was Ériu. And Avergine said that henceforth, Ériu would be the principal name of Ireland. Now, soon after that, the sons of Mill came to Tara. And there, of course, they met the three sons of Cermait, son of the Dagda. And these grandsons were called Macul and Macecht and Magrenia. So let's find out a bit more about these guys. So the story I just told you is from the Book of Invasions. And this is from an earlier part of the Book of Invasions. So the three sons of Cermait, Mealvale, that means honey mouth, son of Ochi Olahur, who is the Dagda by another name, were Macul, Macecht, and Magrenia. Macul, the hazel his god, Eher his name, Banba his wife. Macecht thereafter, the plowshare his god, Teher his name, Fódhla his wife. And Magrenia further, the son his god, Ceher his name, Ériu his wife. So, like I say, we were in the Book of Invasions, and the story, the little story I told you, is from the coming of the sons of Mill. This is from the coming of the Llŷr de Danann, which happens earlier in the story. So these three gods have names which are clear and simple. Col literally means hazel, and cecht means plow, and grenia is the word for sun. In spite of the way the scribe words this passage, it's probably fair to say that Macul is the god of the hazel, and maybe by extension, the god of the woods and the wild places, while Macecht is the god of the plow, of the land given over to agriculture, and Magrenia is the sun god, the preeminent one of the three, just like his wife Ériu is the preeminent goddess of the three. And much of the Book of Invasions is preoccupied, of course, with the clearing of land for agriculture. Interestingly, it's only in the later times of the Fenian cycle that the woods and the wild places are seen as beautiful and worthy of praise. But whichever side you're on, the wild or the tame, it's still ruled, by the sun. Irish storyteller Sorcha Hegarty, who's one half of the kind of candlelit tales brother-sister act, she says she sees Banba and Macul not only as deities of the wild, but also as related to war, and that kind of wildness, while she sees Ériu and Magrenia as kind of transcendent, which I think is a great word. Of course, these three goddesses are daughters of a deity called Ernvas, who's simply called a female farmer. And you may know that Ernvas is also the mother of the other famous triple Irish deity, the Morrigan. So that's kind of four trios all crowded together among the Llŷr de Danann in the Book of Invasions. We wouldn't have to look too hard to find more, of course. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. You can find out more about them at the link which is on your screen now. You can also support my work on Ko-fi or by becoming a patron. You'll also find free content to read on my Patreon page and on my website. All the links are in the description. Typically, there tend to be more examples of whatever you're looking for in Irish texts and in Welsh texts. And that's just because the Irish corpus is so much bigger. There's more manuscripts, more stories, more characters. But there is a trio who's associated with skill, the three sons of Don, Amaethon, the farmer, Govanen, the smith, and Gwydion, who's a poet and a magician. And once again, we see a trio identified by skills. You might be wondering whether this other son, Gwydion's other brother, Gilvaithwy, whose primary skill appears to be rape, there's a good chance he's something like an aspect of Gwydion, or more likely a character added to the story that we find in the fourth branch. Not an original character, so to speak, more of a literary device. So both Ireland and Wales have literature known as triads. And it's interesting that both traditions find 3 a very handy number for remembering things. And this kind of runs in tandem with the way things often happen 3 times in traditional stories. But the Irish triads are nothing really like the triads of Britain. So many of the Irish triads are simply proverbs, kind of wisdom sayings. So we get things like three unfortunate things for a man: a scant drink of water, thirst in an alehouse, or a narrow seat upon a field. Well, fair enough. Others do list kind of three things, but it's often difficult to see clear stories or reasons for choices like this: the three forts of Ireland, Dunseverick, Dunkervna, and Caer Conry. But of course, there's more than three forts in Ireland. So why these three? The triad isn't telling us. The triads of Britain are usually a bit more forthcoming. They may reference stories which are lost to us, but they usually offer us some hint of what those stories were. So while the so-called triple deities we've been looking at so far tend to be about one entity or a trio of entities doing different things, the Welsh triads often compare three similar scenarios which happen to different individuals, like the three exalted prisoners of the island of Britain. So Llŷr, half-speech, who was imprisoned by Eroswydd, and the second Mabon Epimodron, and the third Gwair, son of Gairioedd. So in this case, we do at least have kind of remnants of all three stories in other places in Welsh literature. So this is kind of a memory aid for the bards to remember stories. That's what we think. A more puzzling triad might be the mysterious three Gwenhwyvers. So Gwenhwyvar, daughter of Cwirid Gwent, and Gwenhwyvar, daughter of Gwythyr, son of Graidiawl, and Gwenhwyvar, daughter of Ogryvan the giant. Okay. Now, the usual Gwenhwyvar in Welsh texts is the daughter of the third guy, Ogryvan. So nobody's quite sure what's going on here. Even the redoubtable Rachel Bromwich doesn't have much to say with any certainty about it. She throws out a couple of possibilities in the book. It would probably be a mistake, though, I think, to see this as a case of a triple deity. I've seen this put forth that Gwenhwyvar represents a triple deity because of this triad. We'd have to prove that Gwenhwyvar represents a deity at all, I think, from an earlier layer of mythology. I think that's doubtful. People have different ideas about that, and also about Arthur and, Finn and all sorts of things. But it may hint at a complex story which is lost to us, might be intended as humor. That's one of the possibilities that Bromwich throws out. But there's something going on with Gwenhwyvar, because another triad known as the three harmful blows of the island of Britain, the one that includes the blow to Branwen, tells how Gwenhwyvar was struck a blow by a woman called Gwenhwyvach. So you'll notice that nowhere among these triple goddesses have we encountered a maiden, mother, and crone. And I honestly don't think that you'll ever find such a trio in Celtic myth, probably not in European myth. We have plenty of maidens, plenty of hags, and the hags do occasionally turn into beautiful young women. Whether we should perceive them as dual beings or simply goddesses who like to disguise themselves is another question, because often it is portrayed as a blatant disguise. So how did the idea of maiden, mother, and crone become so firmly established in neo-paganism? Well, I think it's a mixture of things. Obviously, women, like all breeding livestock, have always been sorted into like too young to breed, breeding age, past breeding age. And that's maybe a kind of brutal way for me to state it. But it's more than just a social reality, of course. It's a biological reality. And even though males are often capable of breeding in old age, they don't entirely escape the idea of youth and prime and old age. But the neo-pagan idea, I think it's partly, a lot of it's Robert Graves. And I think James Fraser is probably standing behind that, because Fraser tended to see everything through the lens of fertility, while it was Graves who shaped modern thought about Hecate and triple goddesses in that sense. And then Carl Jung gets in there too, I think, with his archetypes. The goddess movement comes along, and the woman's movement, and adds, their ideas about celebrating everything to do with having a womb. Menstruation, pregnancy, menopause are all presented as these beautiful moments in a woman's life. Now, Some of this feels awfully like gaslighting to me. But, maybe that's because I never wanted to breed. So all that womb stuff has just seemed like, one big monumental hassle as far as I'm concerned. I very much resent being sorted for the cattle market based on my breeding status. And while the biological reality is undeniable, I find the red tent kind of boring. If you like that, that's fine. But quite a lot of pagan women don't wish to identify with it. I've seen a couple of great discussions online about that kind of thing. Somebody kind of asks that question, do you go along with this maiden mother crone thing? And, there's a segment of women who say, yeah, I find it really beautiful and useful, and that's fine. But there's a big segment of women that go, no, that's not how I see myself in terms of motherhood or not motherhood, which is, basically what that's about. So let's move on anyway. I don't think there's any precedent for it in Celtic culture. There's one final piece of triplism in Welsh lore that I think is very important, and this is the trio of deities often thought of as ancestor deities. So their names appear at the beginnings of stories, kind of as the unseen parents or grandparents of the characters. And these are Dawn and Llŷr and Beli Mawr. So we know relatively little about them. Dawn is assumed to be a cognate or reflex of the Irish Danu, and as the mother of a trio of skilled sons, Amaethon, Govanen, and Gwydion. This is an interesting parallel because Danu is the mother goddess, if you like, of this very skilled people, the Danan. And these skills are especially kind of earthy, especially Amaethon and Govanen. We met Llŷr earlier in the triad about prisoners. Llŷr is the father of Bran and Branwen and Manawyddan, who crossed the sea in their story, and the name Llŷr literally means sea. Beli Mawr is a little more complicated. The name Beli is open to various etymologies. Nobody's, the arguing hasn't stopped yet. One of these is bright and therefore might relate to the sun and by extension the sky. Many scholars lean toward other explanations of the name. It could be something to do with warfare, or it could be something to do with the Belgae people or Bolgios, they're one of their leaders. So whatever the true origin of the name, it seems like the idea of the sun and brightness was widely associated with Beli Mawr in Welsh culture for many centuries. Whether that's actually the correct etymology or not, we have to look at what were the people actually associating with the name. So these three, Dawn, Llŷr, and Beli, are sometimes seen as representing the three realms of land, sea, and sky, which are so important in Celtic cosmology. So we find these things, land, sea, and sky, referenced in, early Christian prayers, Celtic prayers, and charms, often as the power of the land, the power of the sea, and the power of heaven, for example. But we also see evidence of the importance of land, sea, and sky in oaths that are sworn in various stories, and also in tales of shape-shifting or transcendence, as it's described in places like the Book of Taliesin or the Avergeen's famous poem about, I am wind on the sea, I am the stag of 7 combats and all of that. That we almost always find among the animals listed is a bird of the air, often an eagle or a hawk, a land animal such as a boar or a stag, and a fish, pretty much always a salmon. So most of you have heard me kind of teach these stories and poems which give examples of this. So this kind of brings us back neatly full circle, I think, to our friend Triglav, the god of the upper and middle and lower worlds. And this isn't quite the same thing as land, water, and sky. Each culture has differences. Each culture has its own expression of things. So let's not kind of mush them all together. But at the same time, there's plenty of evidence for Celtic people seeing water as a kind of portal to the underworld. you only have to think of many offerings given to water, and also the fairies and the strange beings which emerge from water in folklore, to see that there's a connection or a similarity, particularly with fresh water. In the land, sea, and sky trio, the meaning is a little bit different, I think, if we think land, water, and sky.